I want to welcome everyone to I hate to say it, the final installment of London Calling. It has been a great series, and I'm so happy that it's going to end what I would consider on a fantastic note with three very, I would say, special, near and dear designers and artists to us at the HMCT. Back in, I believe it was March, both you three were our typographers in residence at the HMCT in Los Angeles working on your project. Josh Trees, Yvan Martinez, they're both in London, designers and educators in London. Krister, Olsson, a designer, artist, inventor, as you can see, in Los Angeles. And they were our 2020 typographers in residence working on this project they'll be talking about when COVID hit. And within a matter of a week, I think we had to shut everything down, abandon the center, and both Yvan and Joshua had to somehow make it back to the UK. So I'm very happy that you're able to now present your work in progress. We hope to also have a catalog about your research at the HMCT ready soon. You can find it on the HMCT website. And then to continue the project with Josh, Yvan, and Krister next spring and hopefully next summer, and in the form of an exhibition in both Los Angeles and London. And Josh, I'm going to ask you to share your screen and to start your presentation on Public Foundry. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Gloria, for that lovely introduction. Okay, so before we can talk about Public Foundry, we feel that it's important to talk about the impetus for the project, which is font as a theory object. The term theory object means different things to different people. So what is a theory object? Well, what we've done is we've collected some paraphrased definitions just to show you the range. So according to Tara McPherson, it's an embodiment of sociocultural theory. In fact, I think she may have been the one who coined the term. Julian Blecker is his definition of a theory object is that it's a thought that becomes its own agent of creativity through circulation and participation. So this is the one that stuck with us the most. A collectively intelligent and shareable concept, according to Bruce Sterling, who has somewhat popularized the term, but not nearly enough in my opinion. So over time, we've sort of synthesized this into our own definition, one that emphasizes the role and potential of design in the equation. So for us, it's a cultural software designed to advance itself through fandom and open source design practice. So while it's not a formula, it does have tendencies. The first would be that a theory object is open source, freely accessed, used, changed, shared in modified or unmodified form. It also emerges and evolves through collaboration and collective effort, also known as collective intelligence. And finally, it carries cultural information that resonates with people, so it's culturally valuable. So under this definition, a font can become a theory object. But I think the best way to exemplify this is by showing you people who we think somehow, in some way, shape, or form, show this in their work. So I'd like to start with Nat Piper and a project called A Queer Year of Love Letters, which is a series of fonts that remembers the lives and work of countercultural queers of past decades. Each font is named after something or the source that inspired it, as a way of directing people towards its history. Let's take a look at some of the fonts and the rationale behind them. So this one is called Robert Ford. He was the publisher of The Thing, a Black and gay lesbian underground arts journal and magazine in Chicago in the 1990s. This one is called Martin Fong, based on an American painter circa 1980s New York, whose paintings contained these stylized forms of sign language that he developed. But one thing is very clear, Piper has an impetus. In their words, my aim is to disseminate and share these overlooked queer histories and the language work of radical queers of the past. I want to be very clear about where it comes from so that some understanding of it is built into the metadata of the font itself. Here's another font derived from the work of G.B. Jones, artist, filmmaker, and musician, and the co-publisher of the queer punk zine JD's, which was out of Toronto in the 80s. And then we have another one that pays homage to the feminist and gay rights activist Ernestine Eckstein, circa 1960s New York. And lastly, we have the Women's Car Repair Collective, a font inspired by the Lesbian Alliance of St. Louis, Missouri in the early 70s. To give you a bit of backstory, the collective offered a car repair service by and for women, including workshops and rental of garage space, tools, and books. Now, this is where you can see the source a bit closer, although it has been reinterpreted. The hand letter writing comes from a newsletter called Moonstorm, rather, published by the Lesbian Alliance as well in 1972. So the rationale for this is first that the font files are durable, and OpenType fonts have persisted in their ubiquity since the 90s and maintained their utility as a nimble and reliable format. Secondly, fonts have the capacity to contain a hefty amount of information within a tiny package. In under 100 kilobytes, an entire alphabet. In the font's metadata, a manifesto. Fonts then function in a useful format for ferrying information from one place to another. I am using these fonts as time machines. Okay, so the next person that we'd like to show you is Trey Seals, who has started a type foundry called Vocal. Vocal is a type foundry that for creatives of color who feel that they don't have a say in their industry. Or in Trey's words, I decided to find a way to increase diversity and empathy in the design industry. I knew I couldn't just change the demographics or the education system. So I tried to figure out a way to introduce a non-stereotypical piece of minority culture into the design itself, starting with the basis of any good design, typography. Each typeface highlights a piece of history from a specific underrepresented race, ethnicity, or gender. So this font is called Martin, and it's inspired by Martin Luther King Jr. and the 1968 Memphis sanitation strike. After 2 sanitation workers were killed by a malfunctioning garbage truck, the workers began striking. King joined their cause and delivered one of his most famous speeches, "I've been to the mountaintop." The next night, he was assassinated. 4 days later, Coretta Scott King led 20,000 marchers through the streets of Memphis carrying copies of a poster that read, "Honor King, End Racism." This font is called Rubin. It's inspired by the journalist Ruben Salazar and the 1970 National Chicano Moratorium. To give you a bit more detail, 25,000 activists gathered in East Los Angeles to march and protest against the Vietnam War, namely the disproportionate number of Latino soldiers being killed. During the march, Salazar was struck and killed by a tear gas projectile fired by the LA County Sheriff's deputy. Trey Seal's fonts helped to keep these voices alive. Okay, this is the OSP Foundry. OSP stands for Open Source Publishing. So it's the typographic arm of the group. And the typeface is called Univer Else, but I've noticed that it's recently been switched to Fluxus Else, and I suspect that that might be because of copyright issues. In the 1998 book, Fluxus Codex, the body text is typeset in a charmingly rounded and dancing Univer that seems to smile playfully at its dry Swiss creator. Adrian Frutiger, 1957. So you can see it here. It's described by them as an irregular digital version of Univer, featuring round angles, floating baselines, and erratic kerning, obtained from scanning printed text pages that were optically composed by cheap photo typesetting machines in the 60s and 70s. But what we can't necessarily see by looking at the font itself is that it was collaboratively designed by 4 people. However, this collaboration is much more than a fun fact. It is an incarnation of the OSP ethos. So to give you an idea of that, I've got some quotes. We think that it is about time to reconnect the tradition of typography again to the freedom of expression. We think it is imperative that citizens can express themselves through the channels that are publicly owned with tools that they can remake if needed. We have started to see how new forms of collaboration with the help of new tools could possibly change the form of typefaces themselves. At OSP, we feel typography is inherently generative, especially since digital files have everything to gain from being copied and remixed. We'd rather work with their constraints and affordances than rely on a contradictory business model that invests more in copyright enforcement than in creative development itself. Okay, the next project is called Nortasuna. It's a collection of Basque lettering found in commercial signs of restaurants and shops of the San Sebastian Old Town. This ubiquitous lettering is part of an urban landscape of many Basque towns. Inspired by ancient stone carvings, it experienced a widespread revival in the 70s and 80s after the end of Franco's dictatorship. As a symbol for Basque identity and tradition. Over the years, the style has arguably acquired a kitsch or even conservative connotations. And this related quote, "The Basque typeface is a communal work of art, anonymous rather than having one or more ephemeral authors, and whose style, through a mimetic process, has been transmitted throughout generations." The next example comes from November, which is Juhi Vishnani and Shiva Nalapermal. November is a design studio based in Bombay, India, working at the intersection of design, culture, and typography. So here we're looking at when they were invited to create an identity for Artists Unite, which is an anti-fascist movement that happened in Delhi and was a congregation of major artists and practitioners in the country, a sort of united front against the resurging politics of hate. And the designers believe it would have been contradictory to create a strict set of brand guidelines for something like this. So their solution was to create a typeface that captured the essence of the movement that can be used by everyone to make the material. An interesting side note, I noticed that the font declares itself to be used by everyone, but it specifically says that it's not open source and that it can't be modified. So, but I thought it was important to include this, as did Yvan and Krister. This is November Library, which is essentially an Instagram that they're using as the research wing of November. It's a public-facing project, and in their own words, it's an attempt to relearn our secular history and to provide an alternative for design students from the spiel they get at school. This idea is to provide theory. November Library can be easily another Pinterest board of exotic design. So now that we've shown you some examples of fonts that function as theory objects, let's talk about Public Foundry. In a nutshell, well, first let me tell you, so in January, we received a Google Research Award to produce Public Foundry. And since then, we've been slowly bringing it to life. It will be an online type foundry and community archive powered by the public using artificial intelligence. Although the digital revolution is commonly thought to have democratized the field of typography by making computer fonts publicly available, digital typeface design remains an esoteric practice. Meanwhile, public lettering and signage are being erased and homogenized through gentrification and globalization. While anyone with access to software can design a digital font, Public Foundry aims to demystify and diversify the process by creating tools for intuitive, collaborative, and generative typography. The ultimate goal is to enable users to upload images of letter forms, photos, scans, drawings, and remix them and convert them into font files. In February and March, we undertook phase 1 of Public Foundry at the Hoffmitz Milken Center for Typography. Our aim was twofold: to investigate invisible letter forms in Los Angeles, invisible meaning erased, forgotten, hidden, ignored, etc., and to test the potential of ML-generated typography. Our chosen source of inspiration was the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives at the University of Southern California, the largest repository of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer materials in the world. At One, we rediscovered historically overlooked intersections of futuristic, feminist, and queer thinking at play during the golden age of science fiction, 1938 to 1946, particularly within this group, the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society, or LASFS for short, the oldest continually active science fiction fan club in the world, founded in 1934 and still running today. Actually, they meet on Thursdays, if anyone's interested, on Zoom now. Back in the day, LASFS met regularly at the Brown Room of Clifton's Cafeteria in downtown Los Angeles to discuss emerging genres of speculative fiction and fandom while participating in the international mail networks and self-publishing fanzines imagining new, different, and better futures. We learned that LASFUS doubled as a liminal space in an underground community for members using fandom to explore sexual diversity and radical politics. Two members, Jim Kepner and Edith Ide, even went on to found America's first gay and lesbian magazines, which spurred the gay rights movement. So what we're looking at here is examples of some of these fanzines, which were produced using a combination of symbol printing technologies, duplicating machines, typewriters, lettering guide templates, giving rise to vernacular typesetting conventions encompassing two divergent camps. Fanzines emulating prozines, professional fan magazines, like this one, and fanzines expressing the voices of fandom itself. So from these sources, we gathered letterform specimen. We then built a piece of software that we call the Combinator. The Combinator allowed us to conduct inference tests using machine learning. So I'm just going to click through some of these so that you get a sense of the highlighted letter is the one that the typeface below is being generated based upon. So essentially, we would feed Combinator the letterform specimen, and then Combinator would infer a full typeface from a single letter, like so. So these results were both puzzling and intriguing. If we take a closer look here, for the input, these are made from the input glyphs from Mimeo-style Roman, which is one of the template letter forms. And depending on which letter we selected, it would produce wildly different results. So the capital F drew an unclassifiable pseudo-serif typeface, which is on top there. And the capital O drew something resembling a pre-embryonic cross between Metropolitan and Hobo. While we initially expected there to be a closer resemblance between input and inference, the inferred glyph sets demonstrated structural consistencies that suggest that merely imitating and replicating the input source might not be the only or best contribution of the machine. In other words, this process has revealed the value of reinterpretation and misinterpretation, specifically as it relates to the history of revivalism in type design. So, this put us in a position where we started reevaluating how to move forward. And in order for Public Foundry to cultivate a typography that goes beyond a copy machine, we must initiate and facilitate ways forward, both artistically and scientifically. A kind of call for a statement of priorities, values, and incentives, and in other words, a manifesto. And that's what we wrote. So we'd like to share that with you now. Public Foundry is the renegade child of post-conceptualism, memetics, and floss. Free, libre, open source software. Public Foundry calls for a new typography powered by the public and the machine, roused by the everyday interplay of information and language. Public Foundry calls for a practice of citizens, designers, and machines intermixing to demystify and diversify the process of font design and distribution. Public Foundry calls for a typographer-less type foundry that is fundamentally and unashamedly public. Public as in people, teaching machines to teach themselves to draw the fonts that represent diverse cultures, histories, and ideas, so that typography becomes as eclectic as the individuals and communities involved. Public as in commons, supporting peer-to-peer production and exchange of handmade, machine-made, and hybrid letterforms, such as folk and found letterforms, often overlooked and dismissed as amateur, vernacular, and ugly. Public as in open and shared, releasing fonts under free, Libre, and open source software licenses, allowing anyone to access and use them, modify their designs and redistribute them, inviting collaboration, experimentation, and speculation. So here we are at phase 2. And as we enter, our focus is shifting towards the following. Well, the first thing would be improving the ML model architecture in order to recognize and extrapolate type idiosyncrasies to the point where we can balance predictability and unpredictability. In other words, teaching the machine to remix rather than replicate. And secondly, to build a user interface that offers tools and affordances that support diversity, inclusion, and preservation across different typographic landscapes. So it seems appropriate to end this talk with a video still from John Baldessari's 1972 performance, Teaching a Plant the Alphabet. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. The Q&A is open, by the way, if anyone wants to talk, but, you know, very interesting. And I don't know who's going to answer this. Could you explain to everyone what mimetics are?
Memes come from mimetics, but it's kind of a, I mean, essentially theory objects are, I don't know if Krister and Yvan agree with me, but I feel like theory objects are the next evolution of what we would call memes, or what we called memes, because I mean, now when we say meme, we think internet meme, and that's certainly a form of memes, but memes are a unit of cultural information that is passed, self-replicating, so that, you know, I don't know if that answers your question, but no, I think, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it does, it does. I think it's just important. There might be some students out there, you know, who don't understand where memes come from. You know, they see a meme and I'm sure. So it's interesting, and I'm curious about why you feel necessary. It's interesting to remix and not replicate, because when you see what the font looks like, and maybe Krister can answer this, you see, and then you see what the machine did in terms of not replicating. It doesn't replicate. It has its own path. And is that because of the software at this point?
Yeah, it's a, can everyone hear me, I hope?
Yeah.
It's a very difficult problem, I think. And we've been sort of struggling with a number of different approaches. At the core, it's a problem of understanding the structure of a typeface versus the style of a typeface. So being able to, when we trained this thing, we based this on a Google project initially, and then we kind of went off in our own direction, but it was trained on hundreds of thousands of typefaces, just so that the machine could try and understand, you know, what comprised the core element of a glyph, like what makes an A an A, versus stylistic flourishes like serifs, for example. But it's not such an easy easy problem to solve. And so we've been basically toying with a number of different approaches. I think our goal in the end was, I think we just found it a little more interesting rather than trying to replicate precisely, to create something that was, and maybe Yvan or Joshua can kind of jump in here, but we wanted to create something that at essence represented what was being fed into the system, but wasn't an exact replica. And so maybe it could lead us in a direction that would be a bit unexpected.
So yeah, I think what is interesting here is the goal that we've been developing little by little is more center of focus around collaborations between machine and humans, as opposed to using just the machine as a way of a simple tool that it basically replicates. So, I think this is being evolving when we start facing the problems and understanding a little bit how machine learning works, how we could basically approach the problem of, shall we replicate or shall we let the machine really participate in the creative process? So it is more about how we can establish interesting collaborations between, again, machine and human. I think that's how really the interest being like stems off right now, or what we're really interested in, how we can address that. Also to move, another thing that we, of course, I think, start thinking from the beginning is if this becomes, this platform, when it's finished, becomes a copyright infringement issue, liability right away. And so I think a really interesting way of doing it, because we have the preservation part, which is, documenting the fonts and creating a typeface. But I think the other part that is important is copyright. How do we work around it? So I think letting the machine intervene and do its part, I think actually, is bringing these typefaces, to the future, the present and future, and, see what happens. I think it's learning from each other, how we can use each other, machine and humans.
I think it also makes it a bit of a living archive. It's not just a mausoleum for type that people have documented, but it kind of creates this constant or evolving dialogue, which I find interesting. But to Yvan, or to Joshua's point earlier in the presentation, the thing that we're dealing with right now is basically control. We want to have some unpredictability, but we want it to be somewhat controlled, so it's just not complete chaos.
It's kind of very interesting that you're starting with cultural artifacts. Let's say the letter forms that you're asking the machine to generate come from cultural and different artifacts. Do you ever think that perhaps once it's in the machine, that someone else could then take this and regenerate it again? I mean, I would seem, if you're looking at creating a free open source to meet the needs of different groups, do you ever see that it won't stop there? That it's going to regenerate again? That someone can take your work and say, this is a good start, but let's see what happens if I ask the machine to again go further? Have you ever thought about that consequence?
Well, I think that's something that, that if people find value in that it's something that we have to anticipate so that we build that possibility into the interface. You know what I mean? So that, and we were initially thinking of letting people, so that when people upload the specimen, they constitute a collection, mm-hmm. and then other people can use the same source material to then generate other versions or to spend time with it with different priorities, or so. But if I understood your question correctly, it seems to be about how
it's exactly what happens. It's an ever evolving language. Hmm. Even after you create it, it doesn't stop. And I think it's very interesting how something could become yet another version of itself quickly, depending upon maybe what the intent is, who the person is, what the culture is, how it's being used. I think it's an interesting concept that you're able to adapt what was created from an artifact, to maybe a current situation or a current statement. I think, you know, you're not stuck with that same font or the same language. I do have a question from someone, from Jimmy Moss. He was interested in the idea of distributing background ideas, manifestos via metadata in the font, like the one in the font you showed by Nat Piper.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something you've experimented with, and can you share your thoughts on that?
Well, personally, I don't think either or the three of us have released fonts that have done that. I think that's why we find Nat's example fascinating as well. But we, you know, exactly where do you embed that information? I mean, do you put it in the font? One place you can put it is in the font data itself, but there's also the README file, which generally comes with, you know, or the licensing agreement also comes with a font. So it's generally a bundle when you download something. But Yvan, you were looking into on one of the fonts where they actually embed the information. So do you want to speak to that?
Well, as of now, I think this is one of the key issues that we have to actually guarantee in order to take for this platform to be responsible and accountable for what we put out there. So one thing is, how can we ensure that these fonts that are being, you know, sampled and resampled and redistributed out there are not just being extractivist exercise. So that's actually one of the ways of the things that we have to figure it out as the simpler way right now, which is what Joshua was talking about, is a bit of how it gets distributed to just like a simple text, you know. So that's the way that you can do. This is something that we and Krister, well, we want to like push further in terms of how can we embed more metadata. I'm actually, maybe Krister can answer that a little bit better, but we're starting that phase actually right now. Next week, we started like looking at all these possibilities. So it's, yeah, it's in progress.
I don't think I can add too much at this point, but I do think it's interesting to somehow, I mean, to your point earlier, Gloria, about, you know, remixing things that the machine has already remixed, remixing. If we use that metadata to store sort of a history of, you know, sort of a genetic history of the typeface, like that could be something that could be interesting. So that might be something we'll look into, you know.
Yeah. Roy Tatum, who teaches, I just want to let you know, he teaches generative font design at ArtCenter. And he wants you to talk a little bit more about the ML architecture. And by the way, ML stands for what? Someone else asked
machine learning.
Machine learning. Yeah, someone wanted to ask that question. Are you using something like this is very technical, TensorFlow? Also curious to hear more about the data set that you are using for training, and if you've added it to the base added to it based on the typography you've been working with. So that's very technical. If you want to read Roy's question.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to answer that, and I hope I don't go down the rabbit hole too much. But yeah, we are actually using TensorFlow for this project. It's based on sort of a hybrid model, and we didn't see too much of the SVG or the glyph component creator in the presentation, because that's the part we're really struggling with at the moment. But basically, there's a two model architecture. The first, which is sort of inferring bitmap typography, and then trying to take that bitmap and then create a vector image from that bitmap. So basically learning the vector language. So that's kind of the hybrid model we're working with. In terms of the data set originally was we started with a Google open source data set. Actually, there was maybe, I don't know, 100,000 URLs, and most of them were on very strange sites in Poland and Eastern Europe, a lot of like free software sites that I'd never even heard of. And they were ephemeral, like some we would download and then they'd be gone the next day. So we basically, part of the project was sort of building up this huge archive of typography, good and bad, and just feeding as much as we could into the system. And then that was supplemented by, you know, our own personal type archives that Yvan and Joshua put together for me. But what was interesting was we speculated that maybe if we picked sort of a smaller but more selective set of type, we might get better results. Or if we picked type that was more in line with, you know, the stuff that we're feeding it, we might get better results. But that actually didn't prove to be the case. We got the best results from the broadest collection of type, from the, you know, the lousiest like hand-drawn typography that people just knocked out in an hour, to, you know, the most labor-intensive Adobe font. So I don't know if that helped answer your question at all, but it's, yeah, we're still sort of figuring out what makes the thing work.
Yeah, and I think you also answered Dan Evans' question. He wanted to know about the ideal digital input format, and you talked about using used, remixed, bitmap photo evidence or a vector-based translation, and I think you just answered.
Yeah, we basically had to build a lot of software to get this to work. So, you know, we'd scan in the source material, we'd basically correct everything, convert it to, you know, 1-bit images. Then we'd run like a command line tracer called PoTrace on it and create vector art that we would then convert, you know, into a format that TensorFlow could understand. And then that would kick out bitmaps for us at the first stage. And then we'd feed the bitmaps back into the model and it would kick out SVGs. So yeah, the machine learning, the learning component is like a small part of it. The data processing and preparation is actually a very intense part of the process.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question from Seth Ferris. He wants you to speak to the value which the machine brings to the project other than automation. Often machine learning projects, it's unclear what the machine itself learns. And he says, sometimes I fear we're merely training machines to better extract value from us. And I'm not quite sure, Seth, if you mean, does the machine have a value system? Or what value? I mean, maybe you can talk to that, the value of what the machine's doing. What are we learning from the machine?
I'm not sure if, hi Seth, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if he's speaking more in terms of philosophically from the machine side of it, or, well, I think that the thing that comes to mind to me immediately is that's why I put the John Baldessari image of the teaching a plant the alphabet, because I feel like we're in a similar position where we're thinking about what biases we're teaching this thing, or what are we giving it, and what are, you know, there's a kind of I mean, there's a lot of debate going on right now about ML bias, and I'm not sure if this is where Seth's going with his question, but I do think that there are a lot of critical questions that we're going to have to ask ourselves right now in phase 2 in order to determine what the impact of this ultimately is.
Yeah, and again, I think it's always wise to ethically think about what you're producing. And then someone wants to know, and I think this is a great challenge, are you then going to take what you've created, right, and artistically create your own works from the fonts that you're creating with the combinator? Have you started to do that yet?
Not yet, because it's not, I think it's, from a personal place, for me, I'm looking forward to the scalable vector graphics rather than these blurry renditions, even though those could have a potential value on their own.
I think people have to understand you're just in phase 1, right?
Yeah, just now transitioning into phase 2, yeah.
Right, so what you're seeing is not going to be the final results. I think it's nice that you're opening up your process and you're showing, you know, it's basically the sketchbook.
Yeah, and these questions are tremendously helpful. I mean, it just things that confirming maybe some things that we've anticipated and other things that I hadn't thought about at all.
Right. I mean, it's a pleasure to see something that's not being presented complete. That you have questions about what you're doing and you have questions about the results. And I think everyone's so used to looking at something in a presentation as, oh, here, this is complete and this is not complete. I think everyone should understand that.
Mm-hmm.
This is just the beginning of your process. So as the machine is learning, and as the more you feed the machine and the machine learns, I think I agree with you that you're going to see a lot more refinement occur. I hope that's what's going to happen. And then I can see you take it to the next level of using it, of creating an exhibition. That's the next level too, to show how it can work and then put it out there as a foundry. Interesting. What are your sources? Because you're not finished with your research.
Mm-hmm.
So what other sources are you looking at to have the machine learn from?
Well, indirectly, I can talk about one thing that's now that we've realized that remixing seems to be equally as interesting as machines that replicate or imitate. I've been reading a lot about John Downer. In 2003, he wrote an essay called "Call It What It Is," and in the essay, he kind of maps. I mean, I would like to call it a spectrum, but I think it's a bit more divided than that, because he describes two categories for fonts that are, I mean, he's a bit of context. He's talking about revivalist practices in typography, and he puts all fonts into kind of two main categories. One is fonts closely based on the original and fonts loosely based on the original. But there's the exciting part for me is all the stuff in between. Like, I've got it here in a file. You know, there's recuttings, reclamations, anthologies, surveys, remixes, knockoffs, clones, counterfeits. And then the loose ones are reconsiderations, reevaluations, homages, tributes, paeans, or encore, sequels, you know, etc. Caricatures, you know. So I think it's about trying to teach the machine that that wrong isn't necessarily wrong, but actually leads to all these interesting gray areas.
Right, and leads to different interpretations of a letter form. And I think someone wanted to know, and this is an interesting question, I'll let you guys answer this, the impact it would have on the design and typography industry. I don't know. It's not it can't be a replacement. It's just... Well,
it's another model. I mean, it's another model. And I think that, you know, certainly it's not I think that's what excites us the most about this, is that can there be a different way? And I think there's these examples that are existing, and people are moving forward and doing all this type of work already. There's, you know, several open source projects. This is not anything particularly, you know, new in that sense, but what we're trying to do is facilitate a certain type of typographic practice, and then maybe see what happens.
I think one of the other issues, and it's interesting, and is the issue of copyright. You know, have you found that that's been a concern yet? You know, from what you're extrapolating or what the machine is learning is taking from a source that might have been considered copyright?
Yvan, do you want to speak to that one?
Well, I'm not the copyright expert by any means. I think that depends. I think it depends on, this is like a very, I believe, ethical, I would say, or more value question in terms of where do you place yourself in the spectrum. As of now, I'm not interested. On one hand, I'm not interested in the copyright issues yet. I guess, you know, we'll have a specific in this phase number 2 when we are starting to build affordances for the platform, how we're gonna deal with that. And that's why I'm more interested in the remixing that as a replication. But on one hand, I'm not so much interested about the copyright issues. I'm interested in pushing what does it mean to own a typeface. Because, you know, we cannot copyright the letters, but we can copyright software. So what does it mean? How will this affect? Will have the same impact as what happened to the music industry? How we distribute music, consume music. So how would that, you know, what models are we gonna follow? I know that already Adobe, it was working on something similar. I think they already have a tool. They did a presentation, I think I saw like last year, they did a presentation where you can take a picture already and you can actually, they have a machine learning model that it delivers right away in Photoshop. I think you can start typing and something similar to what the font is. And I think, of course, they're getting away with it because they own the rights to incredible amount of typefaces with the Adobe Typeface Kit. So I really don't know what I yet sit to in that position. For me, I'm more interested in collaboration and how we can, at the end of this project, open, you know, give the code and, you know, and people can start experimenting with it. That's what I'm more interested in. And I'm interested in the preservation, specifically typographic landscapes. That's more like what I really care. I think it's up to people to see what they do with that. You know?
Right. And I think the fact that you're drawing from public signage and preservation, and you're concerned about preservation, I think you might, and also if you're creating the software yourself, it's an interesting issue to see how far you get and how it's distributed eventually. Right now, I don't think you're in that phase, but because you are dealing with historical and cultural preservation, does copyrights actually apply to that? You know, especially if you're starting with your primary sources in the public venue domain, already. Yeah. It's already in the public domain. So already right there, if it's an uncopyrighted public domain or some script written by someone on the street, well, there's no copyright, you know, to that. And please, if someone is a lawyer out there, don't
come after that.
Don't come back to me yet. I want to thank everyone for attending because we're closing it's time to close. But I think this is fascinating, and I can't wait to see phase 2. We'll be working closely. The Hoffmitz Milken Center for Typography will be working closely with Josh and Yvan and Krister. They're not escaping us yet because we want to see the project through. And as I said, again, we'll have a catalog that is a summation of this first phase done at the center, available shortly, we hope. And actually with the catalog comes the printed manifesto, so you can spread the word. I want to thank Yvan and Joshua and Krister for your very interesting work, and everyone for attending. And I hope that you can come back at the end of phase 2.
Us too. Yeah.
Us too.
Yeah.
And thank you again. And thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, guys.